Now that I have children of my own that are old enough to start using their imagination, it reminds me of when I first started using my imagination and the ways that my imagination has grown over the years. One of the biggest ways my imagination grew was through reading. Recently on Instagram and Facebook, I did a 10-day series of posts where I talked about 10 books that inspired me or expanded my imagination greatly over the years. And here I'm going to give a little bit more detailed entries about each one and the significance of what they meant to me and my life. The first book I mentioned was The Magician's Nephew. Now, that's part of the Chronicles of Narnia series, and the first book in the series that I actually was exposed to was, of course, The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe, the first book written in the series, and the one that's most notable, and it's had 2 movies made about it. But The Magician's Nephew is actually the first book chronologically in the series. It includes the creation of Narnia. And the things that are in that book were things that, as a young child, I'd never even thought about before. Namely, the idea of the wood between the worlds, which was a sort of way for you to access a multiverse, the methods that they did that with magic rings, and the fact that they were able to visit a dead world called Charn, in which the world still existed, the planet was dying environmentally, but all of the people were gone or magically transformed into statues. These are things that still creatively inspire me to this day. It's just a crazy concept with the wood between the worlds being one of my favorite visuals of a sort of multiverse, and Charn being this monolithic event in my imagination where I was imagining something that I had never yet to experience or think about creatively. The next book I mentioned was Redwall, and that was actually the first book in the quote-unquote Redwall series by Brian Jakes. It's a story about anthropomorphic animals that are soldiers, and it's like a fantasy tale. Each of the books is standalone, some of them tie more directly to each other. There's a couple sequels, but for the most part, it's just this landmass and the stories that take place there related to a place called Redwall Abbey. This is where I got a lot of tales of bravery and heroics and battle strategies, and also that book has a lot of descriptions of food. I got to learn about food that people eat over across the pond. I was introduced to different European accents, which the audiobooks for those are actually read by Brian Jakes, and they're very good. He does a very good affectation of all the different accents that his character has. They're great. Next was The Oath by Frank Peretti, which was a book that my parents had. It sat on their shelf for years, and I would see it and be scared of it when I was a child. I don't remember what age I read it, but I was quite young. And it was the first of the, what I dubbed, Pacific Northwest style stories that I would ever experience. Pacific Northwest stories kind of inspired by Twin Peaks, where this, small town, normal but maybe not so normal thing where there might be underlying magic or supernatural things happening, but it's kind of not at the forefront. Usually it's a small town where everybody has dark secrets that are hidden from each other, and generally speaking, the dark secrets are related to the plot and or the magical or supernatural things happening. Love these types of stories, and this is the first one I ever experienced, written by Frank Peretti, so of course there's a religious bent to it as well. I thought it was very good. I haven't read it since then, but it was so inspirational to me and my tastes in fiction. The next book I mentioned was Black by Ted Dekker. This was another religious allegory story with black, red, and white, and ultimately eventually green. And if you want to really get into it, all of Ted Dekker, or most of Ted Dekker's books, kind of tie in Stephen King style back to this trilogy. But essentially what it is an allegory of the story of the Bible, from creation, much like the Chronicles of Narnia, through the resurrection of Jesus. But the way that the story is told is actually there's 2 parallel worlds where the story is being told over both of them. One of them is our world, the modern world, and the other one is a fantasy realm with, swords and bows and stuff like that. It's a thriller with interesting stories on both sides and interesting characters on both sides, and ultimately tells a really good story, and it actually does some of the allegorical musings that it does in a very interesting way. Not to give too many details away, but specifically related to the importance of consistency in the Christian life, and also the way that it describes the seismic shift from Judaism to modern Christianity. Done in a way that I'd never seen before, and it just hugely impacted me to this day. I feel like the next book is Give Me, The Fellowship of the Ring, the Lord of the Rings series. Of course, like many other people, especially homeschooled people, greatly inspired me. The creator of fantasy, essentially, doing his big trilogy, and you can include The Hobbit as well. All these books are great, and it tells this epic story that I geeked out about for years and still continue to enjoy to this day. Not a lot of new things I could say about Lord of the Rings. The next book, Charlie and the Great Glass Elevator, was a book that is, it's the sequel to the Charlie and the Chocolate Factory story that you already are aware of, either through one of the two movies or the book, or all three. This one takes place directly after the events of the first one, and it is just a insanely buck wild tale that involves space travel and aliens and aging, and also going back in time so far that you didn't exist, and the concept of that. All these weird concepts in this crazy, short little children's book that just piqued my imagination and had me thinking oh, that's a weird thought. I've never thought about that way before. Or that's an interesting way to handle, a sci-fi element to your goofy little kid story. I can't even remember all the specific plot details to that book, but a lot of it still sticks to me to this day. The next book I mentioned was called Beezus and Ramona. It actually includes kind of all of the Beverly Cleary, Beezus, Ramona, Henry Huggins stories, which are just really basic coming-of-age children's stories from elementary school, maybe into middle school. These stories don't do anything crazy, but instead somehow make regular life interesting and relatable in a way that really affected me, in the way that you could take things that were real and not so fantastical and make them so captivating in a fictional setting, in a way that draws people in and helps you understand maybe where other people are coming from. The next book I'll mention is Ender's Game, another really popular book in the circles that I tend to run in. This was a book I hadn't read until, the last maybe 5 years. And Ender's Game is such an interestingly paced book where the story is going one direction for so long, and there's such a weird plot twist at the end that the story ends on a note that I've never before seen and probably never will see again, by pulling out the rug from under you so fast in a way that's brilliant and confusing, but could be debated at the same time on how effective it was at finalizing the story that it tells. Not to mention you get a lot of anti-gravity sports descriptions, which is an interesting thing to try to follow when you're reading. I've never read the other books in that series, but Ender's Game really sticks with me, specifically for the way that it handles its plot and ultimately its ending being unlike any other book pacing-wise that I've ever seen. And speaking of things that are pacing-wise unlike something I've never seen, the next book on my list is The Gunslinger, which is the beginning of the Dark Tower series by Stephen King. I haven't finished this. I'm only up through the third book of this. But when I very first read The Gunslinger, it's a strange book, and it combines fantasy and sci-fi and westerns and other things that are, it's hard to nail down exactly what this series fully entails, at least up to this point, and I've heard that it only gets crazier. But the thing that this book does is it tells a very interesting and very mixed, genre story that ends in a way that is just the most, pretentious, philosophical, but still wildly interesting, dialogue that happens between two characters, and then 20 years passes and the book ends. And it blows my mind to this day. I cannot explain to anyone who has not read this book just how insane the last part of this book is, and it still leads into the rest of the story. It's just buck wild. And then the final book on my list is really important to me because I essentially, after I graduated high school and got married, had a long break where I barely read anything short of Ender's Game, The Gunslinger, and the two books that followed that. And that might be it. I read very, very few books for the 8 years of my marriage. But before that, I had been such an avid reader that I felt bad leaving it behind and not reading for that period of time, knowing that I probably should, and knowing that it was probably good for me in my brain and my imagination. I had tried to pick up reading again a couple times over the years, and just, it didn't really work with the way that my life was working at that time. Recently, I tried to pick up a short story anthology of supposedly horror or scary weird stories, and it just didn't work for me, and I was starting to wonder if I still had an interest in reading fiction. And that's where the book Pines the first book of the Wayward Pines trilogy comes in. This was the book that got me back into reading, which now has me on this like whole string of books I've been reading like crazy. I don't know why I ever left reading. It came back naturally to me. You know, I've been following like a reading channel here or there, or listening to some reading podcasts. Once again, shout out to Bookish Burrow, a very small like YouTube channel that I found where a person is like very avid and consistent about talking about the like young adult books that they're reading. But for me, the Wayward Pines trilogy was the catalyst that got me back into reading fiction heavily. Not to mention the fact that it's just a very strange story that starts off being a little bit of a Pacific Northwest tale, has a hard shift, and then just becomes this roller coaster of action and sci-fi and intense, visceral experience that is great. And I marathoned it in 1 week, the entire trilogy. They're not super long, but also, like, I was just into them. And because of that, I've been continuing to read a bunch of books. So, you know, since that point, I've read, like, 10 other books just this year in the last, like, month or two. I've been going crazy, I'm telling you. And I'm so into reading again, and I'm excited to talk about the stuff that I've been reading in the future on the channel, but before I got there, I kind of wanted to show you where I was coming from with the books that I've enjoyed in the past. If you enjoy this and want to see anything like this in the future, please remember to like, comment, subscribe, hit that bell if you want to get notifications. If you haven't been able to enjoy books in the past, I highly recommend you try to give it a shot. If you don't like reading, try giving audiobooks a shot. Me personally, I've been enjoying both lately because I've been trying to get an audiobook and a book at the same time. With Amazon, they do like a syncing thing. I don't want to give them an ad right now, but like when I drive, I can listen to the audiobook, and when I'm at home, I can read it on my Kindle, and they sync my progress between the two, and it's been working awesome for me, helping me get through those books super fast. Anyway, until next time, go find an awesome book.